What if I told you the US government once believed the key to conquering the American West wasn't a new weapon, a new map, or a new treaty, but an army of camels? And what if I also told you that these camels, imported from Egypt, Turkey, and the Levant, roamed freely across the American Southwest for decades after the experiment collapsed, leaving behind tracks and sightings that sparked ghost stories, frontier legends, and even eerie tales of a scarlet-colored beast with a dead rider strapped to its back? Today, we're diving into one of the strangest forgotten chapters in American history, the U.S. Camel Corps. This is the story of how a bizarre military experiment tried to reshape the future of the Southwest, how a little-known expedition brought an exotic species half a world away, how bureaucratic politics, cultural misunderstandings, and the Civil War unraveled everything, and why, long after the army gave up, mysterious camels continued appearing in the desert. Why camels? Why then? And did some of these animals survive far longer than historians admit? Let's go deep into an experiment that feels like alternate history, but is absolutely real, and one that raises a strange question that still lingers today. What exactly happened to the last American camels? The idea behind the Camel Corps took decades to evolve, and it wasn't some quirky impulse, at least not at first. As the United States expanded westward during the early 1800s, the nation faced a massive logistical problem. The Southwest was brutally inhospitable. Between Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California stretched thousands of miles of desert, mountains, and empty plains with scorching summers, frigid winters, and almost no reliable water sources. Explorers suffered. Supply wagons broke down, horses died by the dozens, mules collapsed under heavy loads. Every expedition west encountered the same challenges, and every military commander stationed along these vast frontiers complained that the region was nearly impossible to control. Enter Jefferson Davis. Before he became the President of the Confederacy, Davis was Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. Davis believed passionately in strengthening American infrastructure and military readiness in the West, especially as conflicts with indigenous nations, disputes with Mexico, and migration toward California intensified. He reviewed reports from foreign armies, studied travel accounts from the Middle East, and spoke with explorers who had witnessed the endurance of camels firsthand. In desert warfare, camels were unmatched. Davis believed the Southwest was America's version of the Sahara or the Arabian Peninsula, and that the only way to truly understand or control it was with the help of animals built for that environment. He pushed Congress repeatedly for funding, but lawmakers ridiculed him. To many, the idea of soldiers riding camels through Texas sounded like a circus act, not a serious military proposition. Newspaper cartoons mocked the proposal, portraying camel-mounted cavalry charging across cactus-filled deserts. Yet Davis persisted. In 1855, he finally won Congress, approved $30,000 for the Camel Corps under the guise of a military experiment. Davis quickly organized a procurement mission, sending a naval ship on a months-long voyage across the Mediterranean. His goal was simple: bring the world's best desert animals and the world's best handlers to the United States. What Davis didn't know was that this mission would ignite both fascination and confusion across the American frontier, and that it would create a ripple effect of stories that would last more than a century. The procurement expedition to the Mediterranean was an adventure worthy of its own film. Major Henry Wayne, an officer deeply committed to animal science, and Lieutenant David Dixon Porter, a naval officer destined for Civil War fame, were placed in charge of buying camels, negotiating with foreign governments, and learning everything they could about camel care. Their journey took them to Egypt, where they inspected military camel brigades and tested riding saddles, to Turkey, where they haggled with traders and examined Bactrian camels from Central Asia, to Tunisia and the Levant, where they learned how desert caravans trained and maintained their animals. The Americans quickly realized this wasn't going to be simple. Camels varied widely in behavior and ability. Dromedaries, the one-humped camels common in North Africa and Arabia, were faster and more agile Bactrians. The two-humped camels, native to cold deserts, were stronger and endured heavier loads. Instead of choosing one, the Americans decided to bring both. This created unusual hybrid herds with diverse strengths. But animals weren't the only thing they needed. Camels require skilled handlers, people who understand their behavior, feeding habits, diseases, and temperament. So, the expedition hired experienced cameleers, Egyptians, Turkish trainers, and Syrian handlers, including one man named Haji Jolly, real name Haji Ali, who would become legendary in the American Southwest. By 1856, the ship's supply was loaded with more than 30 camels for the first crossing. The journey was difficult. Camels got seasick, struggled to stand on rolling decks, and required specialized feeding schedules. But the mission succeeded. When the camels arrived in Indianola, Texas, crowds gathered to stare at these enormous, alien-looking animals. Some locals were terrified. Others were amused. Some thought it was a hoax. The government, however, was dead serious. A second shipment arrived in 1857, bringing the total herd to around 75 animals. The camels and their foreign handlers were transported to Camp Verde, Texas, where the Army began training them for operations. The first months of the Camel Corps were chaotic, strange, and at times comical. But what happened next shocked even the skeptics. The camels worked far better than anyone expected. As soon as field tests began, the camels demonstrated abilities that stunned the Army. They moved effortlessly across rocky terrain that shredded mule hooves. They traversed dry riverbeds, climbed steep inclines, and crossed open desert without tiring. They carried enormous loads, sometimes up to 600 pounds of equipment. While maintaining impressive speed, they went days without water, then drank gallons in minutes. Soldiers wrote glowing reports describing the camels' ability to survive on thorny desert plants and their resistance to extreme temperatures. But despite these strengths, the experiment faced human challenges. Many American soldiers despised the camels. They smelled terrible. They spat frequently, sometimes with surprising accuracy. Their unusual vocalizations, roars, bellows, and groans, echoed eerily through camps at night. Most problematic of all, they terrified horses. Whenever camels approached, horses panicked, often bolting or rearing uncontrollably. This made it difficult to integrate the Camel Corps with traditional cavalry or supply units. Still, the experiment continued, and the camels were soon assigned to real missions. The most famous was under Edward Fitzgerald Beale, who was tasked with establishing a new wagon road from West Texas to California. Beale initially doubted the camels. He thought they were too strange, too foreign, too different from what the Army was used to. But as the expedition progressed, he changed his mind. Camels carried heavy equipment effortlessly across deserts. They plowed through storms that left horses exhausted. They forded rivers and crossed salt flats with ease. Beale eventually became one of the camel's strongest advocates, insisting the U.S. should expand the program nationwide. His letters praised the animals relentlessly, claiming nothing in the American military came close to matching their endurance. Some months, The camels outperformed every mule and horse on the expedition. But despite their success, public skepticism persisted. Newspapers continued mocking the experiment, bureaucrats questioned the costs. And as tensions rose in the years leading up to the Civil War, the government's priorities shifted. The Camel Corps had proven itself in the field, but it had never won the political approval needed to survive. Then, in 1861, everything changed. The Civil War brought chaos to every branch of the U.S. military, and the Camel Corps was no exception. As states seceded and armies mobilized, experimental projects like the Camel Initiative were pushed aside. Camp Verde, the home base of the Camel Corps, fell into Confederate hands early in the war. Ironically, the camels that Jefferson Davis had imported when he was Secretary of War ended up serving the very government he later led in rebellion. Confederate troops used the camels sporadically, mostly for supply transport. But without experienced handlers or long-term planning, the animal's skill set was underutilized. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army had larger concerns: bloody battles, supply shortages, political upheaval. The Camel Corps simply wasn't important anymore. After the war ended in 1865, the U.S. regained control of Camp Verde and its remaining camels. But the experiment, already weakened, now seemed pointless. The new Secretary of War had no interest in continuing a project that reminded the nation of Jefferson Davis, now a symbol of treason. The Cameliers, crucial to the project's success, had mostly left or been dismissed. The Army lacked personnel trained to handle the animals. Military budgets were focused on reconstruction and Indian wars, not experimental livestock. In 1866, the government decided to sell the remaining camels. Some were purchased by circus owners who wanted exotic animals for traveling shows. Others went to ranchers who hoped to use them for hauling freight across isolated regions. A few were bought by private traders, prospectors, and entrepreneurs, but many unsold camels were simply turned loose. These abandoned animals wandered the Southwest, surviving surprisingly well in the harsh terrain that had once been their training ground. Over the next decades, cowboys, settlers, and travelers reported sightings of enormous camel-like creatures roaming freely. Some accounts described entire herds seen at dawn, crossing mesas or grazing on desert shrubs. Newspapers occasionally reported these sightings with a mix of amusement and surprise. The Camel Corps had ended, but its legacy had only begun to take on a life of its own. After the dissolution of the Camel Corps, the Southwest entered a strange period where folklore and history blended together. Camels, now feral and unclaimed, became part of frontier myth. Some stories were humorous, prospectors suddenly encountering a camel while panning for gold, cowboys waking up to find their horses bolting at the shape of a massive silhouette on a distant ridge, ranch hands telling tall tales about racing camels across desert plains. But other stories were darker. The most famous is the legend of the Red Ghost. This bizarre tale emerged in the 1880s, when Arizona settlers claimed a monstrous reddish beast was roaming the desert. It trampled fences, left gigantic tracks, and caused panic among livestock. Some witnesses described it as enormous, scarred, and wild-eyed. One ranching family reported seeing a strange figure, possibly human, tied to the creature's back. Newspapers picked up the story, embellishing details until the Red Ghost sounded like a supernatural creature. In 1883, the Red Ghost was finally killed. The beast was indeed a camel, one of the last survivors of the Camel Corps, and it still wore a worn saddle. Whether a corpse had truly been tied to its back or whether the story grew through retellings remains uncertain. Other camel sightings continued for decades. Travelers along the Colorado River claimed they saw lone camels wandering the dunes. Prospectors along old mining trails in New Mexico and Nevada reported seeing ghostly shapes moving at night. Even in the early 1900s, residents of Baja California told stories of enormous humpbacked creatures crossing remote valleys. Meanwhile, the few camels that had been domesticated continued working for private owners. The U.S. Postal Service famously experimented with a camel mail route in Arizona. Some mining companies temporarily used camels to haul supplies. High Jolly himself remained in Arizona, where he attempted a private camel breeding operation, long after the military abandoned its project. When he died, local communities honored him with a pyramid-shaped tomb, a monument still standing today. By the early 20th century, the camel population had dwindled. They were rarely seen, and eventually the sightings faded away. But legends remained. Some old ranchers swore the last wild camels survived into the 1930s. Others insisted a few lived even longer, hidden deep in remote desert regions where no one traveled. Whether true or not, the myth of the last American camels endured. Even today, hikers in remote canyons occasionally report seeing strange tracks and enormous unfamiliar silhouettes in the distance. Coincidence? Mistaken identity? Or the faint echoes of a forgotten chapter of American history? The U.S. Camel Corps stands as one of the most unusual experiments in American military history. A bold idea that arrived too early, succeeded too well to be dismissed, yet failed because the nation around it changed too quickly. It was an experiment caught between eras, between old-world ideas and new-world landscapes, between ambition and bureaucracy, between exploration and civil war. The camels themselves proved they were up to the task. It was the politics, priorities, and personalities of the time that ultimately stopped the project in its tracks. But the story doesn't disappear when the army sold the animals. It lingers in the ghost stories of the West, in the legend of the Red Ghost, in the tomb of High Jolly, and in the scattered accounts of travelers who swore they glimpsed a lonely camel wandering the desert long after the experiment ended. Whether the last camel disappeared a century ago or much more recently, the Camel Corps remains a reminder that American history is full of strange, ambitious ideas, some forgotten, some never fully understood, and some that leave behind mysteries that refuse to die. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.